Because if you just simple language change of calling someone a survivor versus someone being a victim makes a huge difference in how they look at that. And when you say you want a resilient city, we want our city to be resilient. What do you think most people in the neighborhood, a neighborhood here in San Francisco, well, I'm resilient. Well, I don't even know what you're talking about, me in a resilient city, most people. But when you break it down to the neighborhood level and you put it in some very practical terms for them and say, are you resilient? Well, I don't know. Says, well, do you know who your neighbor is? Do you help out your neighbor in an emergency? When you're rebuilding a home, do you just raise it a little bit if you're in a flood area? If you're in San Francisco, do you look at how much you can do around earthquakes? If you're on the coast, as I said, raise it a little. If you're near a river, raise it a little. If you're in the Midwest that gets tornadoes, do you have a safe room? And perhaps, just maybe, people in this room can really design like you give a damn. Perhaps you can do that to help make your neighborhood, where you live, a little more resilient. Because when you look at it, if you look at what people do in their neighborhoods, because sometimes we, federal government, I know it may be a shock to you, but once in a while you may forget that we're talking about people and that what we do is about people. And as you design and you make a city resilient, it's about people and how you can design a community at a local level about people and how they can bounce back after whatever may happen to them. And I think it's important for us to continue to look at, when we look at the common denominator, it's about the survivor, about people. And as I mentioned, the team, that whole community, the most important part of that is the survivors, is the public. And preferably long before we have to call them survivors, as they prepare, as they can do some mitigation, simple things that make a difference. You heard Desi talking about some of the innovative things that people are doing. Innovation is going to come from the people who are closest to it, from people who work in the area, who live in the area, who understand what the issues are. And talking to them to understand what's going to work in San Francisco may not work. I work in DC, but I'm from Boston. That may not work in Boston. Even though the cities are similar, they're very different. And understanding what's going to work there, what's going to work in that community, is going to make a big difference in how they recover long term. So I look forward to getting to more of a discussion. I can sit up here and babble for quite a while. Richard's heard me do that probably once or twice. But I'm actually going to it's better if we go to questions at this point.
Thanks, Rich. So I want a little bit of context, because I very much appreciated everybody's comments, and Andy kind of hit on it with that very simple graphic about the designers and everybody else getting together to talk about it. So Rich will remember this. It was 2009, I think it was the very first exercise we did with the brand new incoming President Obama, and it was a terrorist incident in the Gulf of Mexico, attacking our pipelines and our oil production facilities. And the big question is, okay, so what do we do about it? And he had everybody at the table. Rich was there, Craig was there, the entire cabinet was there, and he was talking to Secretary Chu from the Department of Energy, and he said, okay, Stephen, what's the problem? And he said, well, Mr. President, the refined petroleum distribution network within the country emanating out of the Gulf of Mexico is basically a one-track system. There's no redundancy in that system. And the president said, well, why don't we think about if we lose capacity, why couldn't we consider something like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve? He said, it's a great idea, but refined product doesn't last that long. You can put crude in the ground and dig it up later and use it, but you couldn't do that for stuff you put in your car or you put in your house or you put in other things. And President was struggling with trying to understand, and Secretary said, Mr. President, the system is not resilient. And he said, okay, I got it. And then Secretary LaHood from Transportation said, well, that's the same problem we have in the transportation system. It's not resilient. Bridges are crumbling, roads are jacked up, and we got lots of problems. And then Secretary Geithner jumped in and said, that's the same problem with our economic system. It's not resilient. So you start to get the point about, if all you're looking down is the soda straw of the world you live in and you don't elevate your gaze, we oftentimes design pieces of things resilient, but nobody's taking the systems approach to think about the interconnectedness and the relationships between and amongst these things. And if you ever had a question about cascading impacts, think about Hurricane Sandy and think about the initial impact, the kinetic impact from the storm surge and from the wind and the rain, and then think about the prolonged impacts and cascading impacts of a prolonged power outage. Now it's not so, now it becomes really real. Gas stations can't get fuel because the piers are down, but they can't pump fuel because they have no electricity and they're not wired for emergency power, and people start freaking out, right? Trust me, they do. So the point here is, as you think about the discussions here, and so I want to go back to our panel members, and I want to start back with Andy, if you don't mind, and just how do you elevate the gaze of folks in the industry? So you talked about the insurance industry, you talked about incentives, and my optic on it is, how do we remove the disincentives for resilience?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that if you, well, within the world that I mainly operate in, which is usually the corporate world, and again, if corporations got on board with resilient-based design, if everybody was designing from a corporate perspective resilient buildings, we would have more resilient communities. But I'm gonna focus on that for a second. That it is this disconnectivity. The insurers are looking at things at such an incredibly high level, and they are interested in managing their own risk. But if you make any specific one of their risk, one facility, one community for that matter, more resilient, that doesn't really have a huge impact on their management of that risk. If you look at the actual organization itself, and they're looking down here at managing their individual risk, then they don't really have an incentive to do anything, because they can very often insure or transfer that risk. So nobody is really owning that risk at the very site-specific level. In terms of what are the biggest roadblocks that I see, it's really that connectivity between the site-specific level and the portfolio broad level. It's the building owner and it's the city. And I understand that the government has a huge role in this in terms of looking at it from a very global perspective. But if you can get the incentive for the individual building owner, the individual owner of that manufacturing facility, the individual owner of that system, to embrace it without having that disconnection between the financial management at the insurance and other levels, I think that that's a way in which you can really break that down there at the individual risk holder level, and therefore it'll make a huge change at the larger risk level.
Yeah, thank you. Couldn't agree more. And so just so you can prepare yourself, I'm going to ask you guys to ask these guys some questions like in a minute. So go ahead and think about them, jot them down. But to David, it's sort of the question of, building off of what Andy said, the role businesses can play in this, and how did you, in a city like New Orleans, get anybody to listen to you around this issue? So what is the role of business, philanthropic, nonprofit, faith-based, in sort of creating and sustaining the resilience of the community?
Sure. Well, I think you have to first frame it in terms that they're going to understand. And so in a city like New Orleans, where we have 30,000 members of the population who will require some assistance in evacuating, that is almost 10% of the consumer base. And so if you're talking to businesses, framing it from an economic perspective certainly helps drive the point home. And that's what really gets them interested. But on the other side, on the nonprofit and community organization side, what really helps is by, going out there and partnering. I had the pie chart slide that showed how our partner organizations are broken down. And what we're able to do is go into these communities and talk to the people who are already doing the work at the community level. So they've clearly demonstrated an interest in the betterment and the well-being of their own individual communities, and letting them know how important this is, providing them with an opportunity. It's not that people don't want to do this automatically. It's just that sometimes they need to be provided with that opportunity. And so when you give them that chance to get in there, work with their neighborhoods, when we go partner with a community organization, we make sure that we station them and position them in their community. And that's good on every level. It's good because the people who are coming to these evacuation pickup points see familiar faces, and it makes them more comfortable with the process from the get-go. And then it's also good because we have eyes and ears on the ground who then understand the needs of those specific communities. A lot of cities, we like to claim New Orleans is a very unique and special place, and it is. And a lot of times we say that it is because of the diversity of our communities and the diversity of the needs in those communities and how unique each one of them actually is. But I think every city has that to some degree. So having those eyes and ears on the ground that are in those communities working every single day certainly provides a benefit, and they're certainly an asset to us.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm looking out that way and looking for a hand. Yes, ma'am. They got a microphone for you, Sarah.
Even better. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Finnegan, and I'm here representing Sonoma, Mendocino, Lake County Red Cross. Yeah, we have three of us here. I'm very interested, actually, to hear more about the evacueers. Have you opened this opportunity to other cities? Do you look for expanding it to other areas? One of the areas with the Red Cross in our counties that we struggle and look for partners for is evacuation for vehicles to actually bring people to and from the shelters. That's a service that we seek partnerships with. Is this something that would be coming west, or is this something that you're focusing more in the southern area of the country?
So we were just formed in 2009. So over the last 4 years, we've really spent a lot of time kind of honing and perfecting what we do in the city of New Orleans. And the interesting thing about what we do is that we've kind of evolved to fill a need. We were born out of recognizing where there was a gap in the city-assisted evacuation plan, and then just kind of popping up to fill it. And so as we've perfected that, now we're just beginning the process of looking outside of New Orleans and other communities that have evacuation needs and are able to, not only evacuation needs, but I think our model especially works well with communities where the disaster or the event is something that can be predicted. That way we're able to kind of pre-position people as we need to. But there's certainly a lot of lessons to be learned through what we do in building those relationships with emergency managers. I mean, a lot of them are very reluctant to allow civilians into their plan. And so I think, what we've done is really develop some best practices around how to develop that level of trust that allows you to go in there and work side by side with these people who've been training to do this their entire lives. So yes, we are open to the idea of expanding. We don't really know what that looks like yet, but it's all part of the natural evolution of our organization.
So in the short term, is there a place folks can go if they have an interest in understanding the lessons you have learned and the best practices you've established? Absolutely.
Evacueteer.org is the name of the organization. It's the name of the website. We like to keep it simple. You can also email me. It's really easy. It's david@evacueteer.org. I would be happy to answer any and all questions.
Bam. Thank you. Come on. Somebody else got something. Yes, ma'am.
A specific example of the type of thing in design that an insurer would provide financial incentives for. So what's a specific improvement in design?
I'll give you an example, and hopefully that'll answer your question. So we were working for an organization, high-tech organization, and we were brought in from their business continuity planning team in terms of could we help them write their business continuity plan from a consulting basis. And we were helping them. They were designing a brand new facility for their 10,000 people. And they had assumed in their business continuity plan that the facility would be out for, because they had been told this, which was probably accurate, that from an earthquake perspective, they would be out for 6 months, or 6 months to 2 years, depending upon. And that would kill the organization. And so this is a major high-tech company. And so from a business continuity planning perspective, you then have to say, okay, we're going to get all of our senior executives there, and we're going to do this, we're going to have this, and then just from a facilities perspective, never mind an IT perspective and other things. What we then said was to say, well, wait a minute, why are you designing this facility so that it can be down for 6 months to 2 years? Well, that's what it is, right? That's what you do. And they said, no, you can design it essentially from just from an earthquake perspective, putting in additional braces or structural elements and mechanical elements and just different ways of designing it for 1-2% more, maybe 3% more. And you could essentially walk into it, a week later or the next day, or very, very stringent performance criteria, right? So they ended up revisiting their design. And then in terms of the insurance markets, we then went to the risk manager and introduced the risk manager to the business continuity planner and introduced them to the real estate person. And we said, did you know that the person who's designing your facility we can now get that to have a much better performance in the earthquake. And then so we said, could we, let's speak with your insurance broker. We spoke with the insurance broker. We asked the insurance broker, we said, hey, what are you assuming when you're pricing, when you're going to the markets for this client in terms of pricing for insurance? Do the markets understand that the performance is now going to be much, 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 much better? And they said, no, actually, that's a good point. We then went with them to their underwriter meetings in London, sat in a room with the senior property underwriter for one of the Lloyd's syndicate who's been writing earthquake insurance for 25 years, said he had never spoken with an earthquake engineer in his life, even though he's been writing earthquake insurance 25 years. And then, we described the situation. Over dinner that night at a nice curry on Brick Lane, he whispered in my ears, you just saved your client £2 million. And so, and I didn't even charge my client for that. And I paid for dinner, I think, I seem to remember. But anyway. We're cheap. No. But the point is that there are many things, both from an earthquake perspective, from a wind perspective, from a flood perspective, from all these different perspectives, that the code is there to save life, not to save business, right? And believe me, I've been to Haiti, or I was in Haiti a week after the earthquake. Saving life is a fantastic design criteria, but we can go beyond that. And we can make communities more resilient, again, by making the organizations more resilient. The organizations can be more resilient by taking this ridiculous notion that that the markets are over here and the designers are over here, and that the real estate manager does not know the risk manager, and that happens quite a bit. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's an example of, maybe too long of an answer.
Yes, ma'am. See the second slide? Yes, you can. You should. It's here somewhere. The second slide. Yes, Desi's presentation. Yeah. See, she was smart. She said, there is a second slide. Somebody needs to ask me about it, and you did. That one?
That is my second slide. What's the question? Anybody? Is it just, what is the second slide? That's the best. That's the best. Okay, great. That's the best question because that gives me complete white space to come up with an answer. Okay, I don't know if I can relate this to robots, so someone should also come up with a robotics question at some point. But this group right here is, this actually has everything to do with designing like you give a damn. These are students from all over the nation right now. We're working with this field innovation team from Design for America, and Elizabeth Gerber, and a couple of other really fabulous folks. They are all part of a leaders brigade that went to a summit recently, and they said, hey, we've got to decide what we want to work on. And I'm like, hey, we got this great team. It deploys to disasters. You are brilliant designers. Can we work with you on some great possible challenges that you can solve from a design perspective. As we found in a lot of times in disasters, it's really designers that can come up with some pretty interesting ways to look at the problem very differently and come up with interesting solutions. So right now, these excited, you can see there's actually one that looks incredibly exuberant and a red shirt. She has her eyes closed. She's just like smiling so much. But they are all so excited to join us, the Field Innovation Team. So this cadre and a whole lot of other guys around the United States right now are catalyzing these challenges in the emergency management field with our Field Innovation Team to solve it from a design perspective. So if you want to know what they're going to come up with after their semester in December, we're going to have a conversation. We're going to have a big, giant phone call, and it might even be a think tank. We haven't decided that yet. But we're going to talk about the great prototypes they came up with. And I guarantee you, because this happens every time, that at least one or two of the things that they come up with, we are going to take down to a disaster, and we're going to deploy it, and we're going to highlight that great student's work. So I hope that answers your question, and I really do hope somebody asks a robotics question.
Nobody ask a robot question. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Caitlin. My question for you guys is, so you're all working to design for disaster issues. But when you're thinking about the long term of the things that you're implementing for disaster and emergency relief, what projects have you worked on that have a really long-term goal that will be part of the community afterwards and give a little bit more than just for emergency situations?
Sure, thanks. Actually, Desi and I were up at MIT this past spring or summer and talking with a group of students who are actually looking at how they can not just build a community that's safe and for an earthquake, and it happened to be here in San Francisco area, but how that community can also be green, and how that community can also have power if power goes out subsequent from a disaster, how that community can work within and have a community center for folks that can then double as other things as well. Because the vast majority of times, as the community is being designed, that it's not during disaster time, and how you can, but as you're designing a community, an area, that community can also function on a day-to-day basis, but design in certain things, such as if there's a supermarket or they have a supermarket in need to feed people, that they can be self-sustaining for a while too, with gardens that they utilize to make sure that there's greenery, but the gardens then can sustain people in that community, all designed quite a bit. Does he want to fill in the blanks on any of that?
No, I think you did a pretty good job, but I wanted to highlight one really cool thing that FEMA's doing, and it'll be, 30 seconds. We did a physical floor plan of the Disaster Recovery Center. So we sent designers in, actually Frog, a German-based company, and then ITP students from NYU. And they went in and they looked and observed the physical flow of the disaster recovery centers and saw how survivors were moving through it. Now, how this works and other things, I'll explain in a minute. But basically, because of that, Rich and the team is now working on changing the physical layout and flow of these centers to be more survivor-centric. And it wouldn't have been without that design thinking in mind. That we wouldn't have thought to do that, and it's actually going to save time, money, and most importantly, it's going to help survivors. But how that relates outside of the disaster recovery centers and even out of the space of the disaster spaces, we started looking at ways in steady state to implement these whole of community principles, these design principles, and at the moment, FEMA's knocking down the walls to create a creative space within FEMA headquarters.
I'm going to...
We literally knocked down the walls at FEMA. just so in the 8-story headquarters in D.C., half the floors, there are no more walls.
Speaking about long-term design, though, and this might just be a product of me not only living in New Orleans now, but having been born and raised there too, and just kind of seeing the evolution of what's happened there after Katrina, it's certainly been inspiring. I mean, the ability for people to come in and really just try new things to create a better community has certainly been fun to watch. But speaking to a room full of designers, I do feel almost a responsibility to say, one of the best things that you can do when you go into a community that's, kind of recovering or beginning the process of recovering is by exercising a modicum of restraint. And what do I mean by that? I mean, take the time to visit with the people who live there to gain an understanding for not only what they're currently going through, but what they loved about their community beforehand, and really kind of, incorporate that cultural awareness that you'll gain through that process into your design. It's going to not only make for better and more acceptance of what you come up with, but I think it's going to make for better design in general. And I think that cultural awareness and sensitivity goes so much further than a lot of people realize. And I think I'm probably preaching to the choir at a conference like this, but just based on some of the experiences that we've had, I want to make sure that doesn't go overlooked.
Yeah, and I just want to pick up on the tail end of that. And I think another thing you can, we always spend a lot of our time and energy thinking about, right of boom issues. Bad thing happened, what are we going to do about it? And we don't spend enough time left of boom, so before the bad thing happens. And this is where I think, as an organization, as a coalition of the willing, if you will, in terms of the design community, the engineering community, and all that have a stake in resilience at a community and a local and indeed and even a national level, can begin engaging at that local level, right? So talk to a guy from the mayor's office. I know for a fact there are 40 gazillion things on everybody's agenda every day, but to have a conversation at a community level with your local elected leaders about how we can begin thinking about these things. We have nothing but lessons learned from, pick a disaster from Katrina to Andrew to Ike and Gustav and Oklahoma and Joplin and Tuscaloosa, Alabama and Haiti and Japan, and the list just goes on. And there are things, simple things, whether they're, to Rich's point, on the mitigation side of the house through a regulatory scheme, or there are simple things from just the community neighbor perspective that can be done. And that's really the challenge of resilience, because there is no magic pill. There is no sort of algorithm that is, starts with this and ends with that, and here's how you get there between the two. It really is a bunch of conversations with a lot of different people about issues that range the gamut from transportation to security to healthcare to all of those things. And so it's about how do you elevate your gaze. How do you understand the threats and vulnerabilities of your community? As he said, Boston is different than San Francisco in some ways. And how do you sort of attack it with some focus and a comprehensive, integrated approach to having these conversations? I think at the political level, at least my experience at that level is that's the conversation worth having, because a lot of times our electeds have a lot of things on their plate and haven't had the opportunity nor the expertise internally to those dynamics. And so I wanted to swing it back to Rich here in terms of whole of community. So you've heard this term whole of community. You've heard the president talk about an all of nation approach, a whole of community approach, and all of an enterprise or an organizational approach. And I just wanted to let you wrap us up with, what does that mean?
I think the thing that it means is that you can make a difference. I listed the people in the whole of community, the federal, state, local, the tribal governments, the faith-based, the Red Cross. But it really comes down to you, that you can make a difference as designers, you can make a difference as a neighbor, and you can make a difference as being part of your community. How you design your community, how you live in your community, and how you can work with your neighbors. Because when it comes down to it, one, two, a room full of people can make a huge difference. Some of the innovations that Desi talked about made a difference. The things that you can design, I'm not a designer, I have trouble figuring anything out like that. But what you can do is you can ask the questions to people like me, to Daniel in the back of the room from the city of San Francisco. You can ask us questions with your expertise, so then you can help design a better community, a safer community, lives are first, but a resilient community that can bounce back. Don't underestimate what you can do. Don't underestimate you as an individual and you as a professional because you can, and I would suspect many of you already have, made a difference. But don't stop. I'm challenging you to show how you can make a community safer, better, in some way that you'd want to live to make a difference.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rich, and I want to thank all of our panelists. And as I understand it, we're going to do a breakout session out here because I know somebody wants to know about the robot. And I think there are probably a couple of other questions that I know I saw a few hands we didn't get to, so apologize for that. But thanks for coming. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for your interest. And more importantly, thanks for giving a damn, because I think that's what matters.
So we'll have a breakout session back here, but we'll have the keynote at 5:30 back in this room. So please come back.